a question many Christians have is whether we should tithe. And tithing for most people means giving 10%. We'll return to that question. The first thing I want to say is good Christians disagree on this. This isn't the clearest thing in the scriptures. And maybe the second thing I'd want to say is it's an important question, but it's not the most important thing. It's the kind of thing that we as Christians can disagree on and have good fellowship together.
I think that's
if we disagree on that matter. I would say, is a tithe required? 10% tithe? I would say no. Because the tithe is part of the Mosaic covenant. It's part of the Mosaic law, the covenant made at Sinai with Moses. And
all right, so I think this is where the disagreement starts to happen with, and he's going to explain himself, but I want to interject here a little bit. When we say that it was part of the Old Testament law, part of the Mosaic covenant, what we're saying is the book of Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, even Genesis and Exodus, there are certain things written in there that were written to a theocracy, to a people that governed their nation. Just like we have a constitution and amendments that govern us, that don't govern other nations. So the Israelites had a law that governed them. For example, let me ask you, the Ten Commandments, is that a moral law or is that a civil law?
That's a moral law because all of those are not upheld by our nation.
But here's the thing. For Israel, it was both. It was a moral law in the sense that these things are right, just, holy. But it's also civil law because if you disobeyed it,
you would be stoned.
You would be killed. Or there was some level of punishment that came with it, which is, you don't do that with a moral law.
No.
Like we Christians live by a moral code.
Yeah, so that's something that we uphold, but not everybody upholds that.
So when the gospel comes, the gospel kind of breaks down the barrier of dividing national Israel from all the rest of the world, the Gentiles, and brings in Gentiles into the holies of holies, which is the spirit where the people of God gather. Before it was in the temple, and only certain priests, after they've done certain cleansing rituals, and then after they've
a lot of cleansing rituals.
Right, and now only certain times of the year could they enter into the Holy of Holies. That was the only time that you would actually be able to be in the presence of God. Now, whenever the church gathers together, they are in the presence of God. The Spirit is gathering them together to be in the presence of God, worshiping God, right? So the old Mosaic law, it's not that it's like we're like, we don't need that anymore. We got Jesus because Jesus gave the law, because Jesus is God. But rather what we say is, through the lens of the gospel, how do we then understand the law in light of the walls being broken down? And I think that's where the mix-up happens, because once we start to say that there are certain aspects of the law that must be abided by as they were in the Old Testament, then we're leaving out the gospel. Anyway, that's my perspective. He does a better job of explaining it.
And the New Testament is very clear. We're not under that covenant any longer. Galatians 3, Romans 7, Hebrews 9 and 10. So there's a lot of texts that indicate we're not under the Mosaic law. The tithe, the 10% that was given, is actually tied to the tabernacle and the temple, to the Levitical priesthood. I mean, where did those tithes go? They went to the temple. They went to the tabernacle. They went to the priests. Well, we don't have a temple or a tabernacle anymore. We don't.
Right. That's important. So the money that they did collect from the Jews to give to the temple, they did use for the upkeep of the temple. They did use to provide for the priest food and their necessities, and the things of the temple needed to be upkept as well. But we don't have those things anymore. And I think it's wrong to say that now churches and pastors are like I don't know how you would say, like a mirror of those things.
I think it's like, it would be very wrong to say, just because there was so much pressure put on the actual priest of the Old Testament. So much. Could you imagine only one man being able to enter into the Holy of Holies, to be able to have communion with God only once, twice a year, if that? And he entered fearing for his life, because if there was any sin found upon him, any sin, he would just drop dead in that very moment. Pastors nowadays and preachers and anyone,
Yeah.
they do not have that fear anymore.
Because of Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the grace of God. That's good that we don't have to fear dropping dead. Like,
But that was the whole reason as to why people would come and pay that much money, was because this is the only man that is able to come into the presence of God. Therefore, he's the only one that has communication, direct communication with God. Nobody else has that. So they paid to come and hear this person teach that had revelation from God.
Well,
They didn't have the Bible then.
I don't think that was so much the purpose of them entering. It was just an opportunity to be in the presence. I mean, he did speak. There were times where he spoke. Like we see instance with that in Matthew, when I believe his name is Zechariah. Zechariah enters in and he meets the angel. And he tells him about his son, John the Baptist, who's going to be born. That's an instance where he does, in fact, speak. But the Levites were given a certain portion of the tithes and the offerings because they didn't have any land. The land went to the rest of the tribes of Israel, but the Levites were given the temple.
Yeah.
So they were supposed to dwell with God. They were supposed to be God's servants. And so as the Levites served, the people would bring and they would be provided for in that way. So
I know at the same time that God was sovereign and he knew, these people need to be provided for. This is a way for them to be provided for while they're serving me and not having to worry about.
Yes. And it does reflect that a bit in the New Testament, where we do see pastors serving God's people, laying down their lives for God's people, and the people giving to provide. But what you don't see is a compelled tax or tithe upon the people, which is what a tithe was in the Old Testament. It was a tax. You don't see taxes being imposed on people because Gentiles were coming to salvation. So you're not going to impose the Old Testament tax system on Gentiles the same way that the Jews were expected to pay tax to the temple. It just wasn't. That just wasn't the case.
Yeah.
Priests are Aaronic priests anymore. Jesus is our great high priest.
Yeah.
The Church of Jesus Christ. We are the temple.
Right.
So
Yeah.
clearly, the tithe, as part of the Mosaic covenant, since that covenant has passed away, it's not required of believers. Sometimes people appeal to Abraham and Jacob giving tithes. They gave 10% on occasions in their life. Abraham to Melchizedek. Jacob, when God met him at Bethel, promised to give 10%. But those are one-time temporary events. There's no indication that this is something they regularly did, nor is there any command, universal command given to believers from those passages. It gets even more complex. Jesus commends tithing in Matthew. So some people look at that passage and say, look, Jesus commends tithing. But we have to be careful there. Jesus also commands forgiving your brother before you offer a sacrifice at the altar in Matthew chapter 5. Jesus spoke to his contemporaries. Jesus lived himself under the Mosaic law because that covenant was in force until after his ministry, death, and resurrection. So Jesus commending tithing when he's speaking to the Pharisees is no indication that it's still in force today. We always have to think, when we read a passage in Scripture, where is this in the Bible?
I think that's important. So he's getting to the notion of context here. Elizabeth says, "What's this pastor's name?" Oh, he's actually he's a seminary professor from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. His name is Dr. Thomas Schreiner. Thomas Schreiner. A super intelligent guy. I really like his stuff, his material, especially on his Old Testament. So Dr. Thomas Schreiner. You can look him up. I forgot what I was going to say. But his point was when Jesus commands tithing, he's doing so under the reality that he lived in the Mosaic law. And what it doesn't take into account in those aspects is that Gentiles were going to come to salvation soon. Mm-hmm. And there was not going to be a temple, and there was not going to be a nation. Mm-hmm. The nation was going to be destroyed, the temple was going to be destroyed, and the people were going to be scattered. And so the giving of the church is to be out of a cheerful heart.
Mm-hmm.
What does the New Testament emphasize? It emphasizes 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, sacrificial, generous giving. Mm-hmm. For most of us, that's 10% at least or more.
So that's really important. Sacrificial, generous giving is the model. Mm-hmm. 10% is a good baseline for a lot of families.
Yep.
If you make 40 or 50, which again, average income, $40,000 or $50,000 a year, that's $4,000 to $5,000 a year
is more than a sacrifice.
Is a lot of money.
Yeah,
it's a lot of money to give to the Lord. Mm-hmm. That's a 10%. That's a new used car. That's a used car that you can buy, or that a few years you can save up, and that's a new car. So that's actually quite a bit of money. You know, that's the kind of giving that is expected of the believer. But if you don't have, like, if you make, let's say, $25,000 to $30,000 a year, which is a realistic number for a lot of families, especially those who are in like more impoverished neighborhoods. Like if you live in the hood, you're not gonna. The reality is that there's an economic disparity between the wealthier neighborhoods and the poorer neighborhoods. You're not gonna expect a family that makes $25,000 and is barely scraping by, saving maybe $100 a month, to just give.
I don't even think they would be saving $100 a month.
Yeah, because we were in that position for a long time. We were still able to give. There were times where we were making maybe only $35,000, possibly 40. 40 was a good year, you know. Yeah. But you know, giving sacrificially meant we gave whatever we had to offer, and a lot of the times it wasn't precisely 10%. But you and I would agree as a family that we did have to give, and there was times where we did have to give. And because we know that it's something that is required of believers, but not again under compulsion, but because we know that it's a joy to give to the Lord.
I mean, and we would give it joyfully, but we knew this is what we had to give, and we never felt shame or guilt because it wasn't 10%, because we're not. God would much prefer us give happily and cheerfully because we love him, than forcefully fearing that we are not going to be able to provide for our family because we felt compelled to pay 10% of our income.
Right. I mean, I don't think you should ever get in debt to give to the Lord. No. I don't think you should ever hold off paying your bills to give to the Lord. If after you've been responsible with everything that you have, and you realize, you know what, a healthy number that we can give to our church is $40 a month, where we're still able to save a little bit for ourselves just in case there's emergencies. You're being wise with your finances. I think God desires that more. If you can give those $40 joyfully, rather than giving $200 out of stress and anxiety, God would much rather you give the 40 over the 200.
And I mean, obviously we know God is watching us. God can see. He knows what our finances look like. And if we're saying like, oh, I could, but I don't want to, then that's a heart issue. That's different.
Right.
Obviously we have to realize, like, where is our heart in all of this?
Yeah. Good point. Did you have something else?
I still am hesitant to give any particular percent.
Yeah.
Sacrificial, generous giving. I would say for virtually everyone, if you're 1 or 2%, that's not sacrificial, generous giving, is it? So God calls upon us to give sacrificially, but we want to heed what the Scripture says and to say to believers in Jesus Christ that we're to give 10%. Well, I don't think that's in accord with the Scriptures. One other point. Actually, when we read the Old Testament, this is a very difficult question. They gave more than 10%. There are several tithes. And sorting that all out, I tried to sort it out once. I didn't spend oodles of time on it, but I tried to sort it out. It's really hard to know how much they gave, but it's probably somewhere in the 20 percentile range.
Yeah.
So the tithe, we say 10% today. That's our tradition. But the tithe, when you add up all the different tithes, the tithe is somewhere in the 20% range.
Yeah.
So if we're really going to tithe according to the Old Testament, it's not 10%, it's somewhere around 20. And as I said, we're not under that covenant.
Yeah.
We're not required to tithe today.
Yeah.
But we have the opportunity, right, the joy of giving sacrificially and generously. Don't take this answer as an invitation to say, oh, I don't have to give generously.
give no more.
I can keep my money for myself.
That's right. Yeah.
God calls
There's a
upon
heart
each one of
issue.
us
That's
to
a
be
heart issue.
generous,
Yeah.
sacrificial givers. He tells us
Yep.
that will increase your joy.